Well, I decided that today, and I think from now on, I'm kind of excited about recording from my office. A, because it's cooler in here, and B, this is a much better camera. I'm wearing for today the Parks and Recreation Roosevelt shirt. It's got the gay penguins, which are always a hit. We got Leslie Knope here, the waffles. I don't want to just advertise for Roosevelt's, but this company, they just make me happy. Anyway, so I've been thinking a lot about trying to talk a little bit more about mental hospitalization, as it is something that many people don't understand, and there's so many misconceptions about. So I had the idea. I wrote a blog post long ago, which I'll link to this video, that was actually what to expect when you enter the mental hospital, and I'll kind of go over that a little bit. Once again, also, I've published a memoir about my time in St. Simons by the Sea, and I have no problem naming them in this video, because to this day I think very highly of the treatment that I got there. So there's absolutely no negativity at all. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that can go wrong, and how there are. I'm getting a lot of this from the Pod Therapy podcast. There are not good programs, but I was extremely lucky to have the positive experience that I had with St. Simons by the Sea. Anyway, I'll link to the blog post, but my memoir also just discusses the experience that I had in that place. It's a really more at the very beginning, because being hospitalized is itself extremely traumatic, which again, I'm getting way ahead of myself. And, a lot of times these videos turn into rambles, but any hospitalization is going to be traumatic. So relating and discussing the trauma of hospitalization is not, I need to turn the alerts off, is not necessarily a criticism. It's just one of the unavoidable truths of hospitalization, right? So I have the blog post, the memoir, and I'm also going to link one of my more recent poetry collections, because I actually have a few poems in there about the experience as well, which was more like a processing kind of thing. But poetry for me is very much like, this is a very gross metaphor, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to use it. Poetry is a lot like a weird bodily function. It's like getting rid of mental toxins. And if I don't write poetry every once in a while, I get sick. So oftentimes my poems are horribly unpleasant to read, because it's just purposefully excreting awfulness that is built up in my mind. All right, now that I've completely just alienated everyone who's watching this, let's talk a little bit. I have some points I want to make, and I have one question that I thought was absolutely brilliant that I'm going to address. First and foremost, though, I've talked a little bit about when to consider hospitalization. That's a kind of a nervous point for me that people have asked, because, I've been thinking a lot about the phenomenon of dangerous knowledge. There is such a thing as dangerous knowledge, right? Knowledge that can actually hurt you if you have it, but if you dig hard enough, you'll figure this out. And again, going back to the Pod Therapy podcast, you can think about when to hospitalize a lot, in the sense of, when would you hospitalize someone for a physical ailment? It's when they can't live their life normally anymore, or when they are in imminent danger. So I know for me, one of the things that they were absolutely looking for when I was hospitalized was, and I can't believe, as I'm actually talking about this, that it's as hard to discuss as it is, but I had a specific plan that I knew how I was going to commit suicide. And this is I don't really care too much about monetization in my videos. This is definitely going to throw it straight into demonetization, which is okay, because I kind of think that type of thing is interesting. But suicidal ideation is something that's extremely common for people with depression and other mental health struggles, because oftentimes it's just really hard for us to control where our brain is going. So like the specificity of the plan is what made it dangerous for me. I knew exactly how I was going to kill myself. I had completely decided on it. I knew what I was going to do. And that level of specificity could get you committed involuntarily. So one of the big pieces of advice I would give for people is if you have a method that you've selected, that you actually have kind of like planned out how you're going to do stuff, you need to seriously think about seeking hospitalization, because, you know, that's a lot closer to the edge than the common sort of like in the moment suicidal ideation when you're like, and this is a weird example, but like if you're jogging on a bridge and you all of a sudden are thinking, man, I could just jump over the bridge and that would be it. That's actually a lot less worrisome, because that actually has a lot to do with some of the compulsive thoughts, obsessive compulsive stuff. When your mind is going in random places, and that's a very specific subset of OCD called OCD bad thoughts. So just because you're having those kind of random weird so that random suicidal ideation doesn't necessarily mean you need to be hospitalized. You should probably talk to a therapist, because I don't know about everybody else, but those kind of thoughts get really distressing after a while. You kind of get used to them. They increase in frequency. Again, talk to a therapist. But if you're like, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it this way, this way, this way. It's time to start thinking about, you know, seeking more dramatic intervention. In any case, what happens when you go into a mental hospital? What's it like? Well, my expectations were dashed extremely quickly. And I wasn't rational going in the first place. So, I mean, any type of expectations, you know, I had to just, I should have known it was just going to be completely. The lobby area was so nice, right? They had like fountains everywhere and nice comfy furniture. And there was like calming, relaxing music. And I was like, shit, I want to stay here, right? I was in that really weird mindset where I thought I was at least going to put the pause button on my life. And that's what I was wanting, right? I wanted to put the pause button on my life because I felt like I had come apart so dramatically that I wasn't going to be able to put myself back together until everything just kind of stopped. I almost had this kind of idea of being like Henry David Thoreau walking into the woods and going to take care of my bean patch for a couple of weeks or something. Or, and again, this is so weird to think about it now, I thought they were going to throw me in a padded room, like I was going to be isolated, that I was going to be cut off, and I was going to have my stimuli reduced, right? Because at this point, I was having panic attacks like 8-10 times a day, maybe even more. That's another reason that you would want to get hospitalized too. My panic attacks were so unbelievably fast and chained together that my ability to go into work and do work was diminished. I was literally like, you know, struggling to function. And that's another one of the things where it's like, it's time to go to the hospital because I'm not living my life anymore. When I went into the hospital area, I was not alone. There were people. It was a common area. And everyone, and it's so funny looking back on this, that I should have known this would be the case. But, you know, we have all these weird preconceived notions. Everyone there was batshit crazy, right? Everyone there, you know, they discourage the word crazy within the hospital atmosphere. But, you know, being on the outside, no, these people were crazy. Some of them were crazier than me. And again, this is coming from the place that I know I'm not functioning well at this point, right? And I'm literally sitting in triage, and there's a guy walking around talking about the Cyclops and the titties. And I'm like, I was wrong about this situation. I was wrong about what I was going to what I was going to encounter. What have I done? It's really funny looking back on it, because there's people crying. There's people calling out into the night, and there's like people walking around with their pills in the cup, and they're mad because their medication has been changed, and they're having a fit. And I'm just sitting there like, this isn't a peaceful environment. This isn't a place where I can just sort of sit and calmly reflect on what brought me here. This sucks. And the thing is, I had that kind of oh shit moment, right? Where I realized what I had actually gotten myself into. Now, this is extremely important though, and this is something that people kind of miss. You have to be surrounded by the stimuli. You can't just run away from it, or as soon as you get stimulated again, whether it be somebody yelling at you or car horns or just the average everyday stuff, you're not going to fix it unless you're facing those issues, right? So when you go to the mental hospital, you are not getting an out to sit in a padded room and listen to the birds chirping outside your window. There are people who have problems more complicated and more apparent than yours. For me, and this is again just kind of one of those weird things, the people with schizophrenia scared the ever-living crap out of me. And who did I gravitate towards for comfort? I gravitated towards the other depressives and the other anxiety-riddled patients. We banded together in order to kind of form a wall between ourselves and the other patients, right? So we started forming connections with other people who understood our condition, and we would kind of run interference for each other and try to protect each other. You never know, at different points during the day, some of the people in the group will be up and some of the people in the group will be down. Those types of connections help model the things that you have to do in the real world, right? Forming support networks, connecting with people, and talking about what's actually going on. And it's really, really funny because like once you're in the hospital, all pretenses are gone because we all pretend that, well, I'm not, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just having a bad day. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm just having a bad month. I'm not crazy. This decade has sucked, right? But when you're all in the mental hospital together, you kind of have this immediate like knowledge, like, yeah, we obviously have problems because we're here, right? So in any case, you can't expect to go in and just be pampered or even just to have silence. It is constantly a stimulating environment. Now, for someone like me who's having panic attacks, I had to do something about them, right? Now, the other thing is, when you go in to kind of play off of this idea of the self-isolation bit, what helps and what makes the big difference is group and one-on-one therapy. The therapies are the things that will help you build the skills, right? I absolutely despised the group stuff when I went in there. Why? Because the group stuff was what was triggering the crap out of me, right? The group stuff would always leave me in a panic-induced state, a feeling of despair, and I didn't want to be around people. But essentially, my relations with other people were what was triggering me to begin with. And I remember, this is going to be in part 2 of my memoir when I finally get around to writing it. I know, I definitely need to get around to it because I got some interesting stories to tell. There was a group therapy session we had called rec therapy, which, like recreation therapy. And we gathered this whole group of, this is one of my favorite stories to tell when I'm talking about this. We gathered everyone together, and this was like a massive group therapy thing, right? So oftentimes they break you into smaller groups, and then like in other times they'll kind of like bring the whole ward together. And this was a whole psychiatric ward thing that we had to do. We had a beach ball. And before they would release us for lunch, we had to basically bump that beach ball back and forth and keep it in the air like 15 times in order to be released for lunch, right? It was a challenge that everybody had to do this. I still have nightmares about this therapy session, right? And again, let me preface this. I'm not complaining because, believe it or not, this is actually extremely important. And this is going to come to the point that I want to make about this video about what you should know going into the mental hospital. So just bear with me for a minute. So we had to keep this beach ball up. Now, for people who have normal mental function, this probably doesn't sound like that big of a challenge, does it? It's a beach ball. You should be able to bump a beach ball back and forth 15 times. It's a game. It's fun. It's not fun for people who have mood disorders and are schizophrenic and seeing stuff that's not there, and people who can't control their outbursts, and people who, can't control their reaction to things. And it's a recipe for disaster, right? So as we're bumping this beach ball back and forth, there are people losing their temper, the ones who drop it. There are people like me who fall apart in anxiety attacks and are crouched on the floor with their hands in their hair, freaking out. There are people who are just mumbling to themselves as the beach ball just bounces off their head and goes to the floor. And the depressives and the people who are more manic are like, John, like, it is absolute chaos. Now, I think, I'm not the type of person who really believes in hell. This would be hell for me. This was awful. And it's funny because, like, for me now, looking back on it, looking at this from the outside, it had to be just freaking hilarious. Seeing this group of absolute crazies trying to play beach ball in a circle, and they're all just completely breaking down emotionally. Now, as unpleasant as this was, and oh, golly, this was probably one of the most severe anxiety attacks I had in the hospital. We had bounced the beach ball, and it had gone 13, right? It was on 13. And a guy who was having very severe delusions about where he was schizophrenic. The ball comes to him. He gets this angry look on his face, and he just goes, "I hate you, Daddy!" Bam! And just slams that beach ball as hard as he can for 14. And of course, it flies at my face so fast that it just goes, right? And I drop it. Now, I may have gotten the numbering wrong there, but I dropped it on the last bounce. So that means that it was my fault that it hit the floor, because it hit my head. The whole circle. This is one of the only times that the people who were clinically depressed, people who had anger issues, people who were delusional, people who were almost catatonic, everyone turned to me and just like, David! The whole ward reacted to me with just this sheer hatred, and I just completely collapsed, right? You would have thought that I had been stabbed, or everyone that I'd ever cared about or loved in my life had like written me a note saying how much they hate me. Like this affected me so deeply, and I just was like, like tears coming down my face, ugly crying, and they pulled me out, right? They pulled me out of this group therapy session, and they took me in with a therapist, and the therapist was like, "Okay, so explain to me for a second why you're so upset." He's like, just let's reason this out, right? And I basically described, I was like, I let everyone down. And, I'm telling him why these emotions are pouring out. And he's like, David, do you really think we're going to hold lunch from you forever? He's like, it's beach ball. It's a game that you're playing. And look at how upset you are. my reaction was, I was like, everybody hates me now. And he was like, David, they're crazy. Why do you care so much about what they think? That was a real light bulb moment for me, right? And in essence, he helped me work my way through my panic attack. He sat me down, we went through it together, and he explained that, all right, you're in the adrenaline rush right now. You feel your heartbeat, your breath is racing. It won't be long before you're going to get like, a not a dopamine, but like one of the calming hormones is going to be released, and you're going to feel it's going to ebb. He's like, think about that. That's coming. And he was like, and let's remember that these emotions are just emotions. They can't hurt you. Those people can't hurt you. They're crazy, right? You don't need to worry about what they think about you. That was a real breakthrough for me, right? That was the first time that in the middle of a panic attack, someone actually guided me through it. At that point, everybody had always been like, we need to call an ambulance. And I'm always like, I'm going to go bankrupt if you call the ambulance. But they sat down with me and they guided me through this incredibly unpleasant, like really scary situation. And that was when I first learned how to put one foot in front of the other and walk through it. I would never have figured that out if I hadn't been in the mental hospital and if it hadn't been triggered in the first place. So in essence, you walk into the hospital, you're walking into a very challenging environment, right? These are the types of things that you have to do in order to get better. You have to go to the therapies. You have to encounter the worst nightmare in order to get the tools that you need to navigate it. It is not a vacation. It is not a place where you can just simply like reset yourself. You are going to be bombarded with things so that you're forced to find paths through that awfulness. Now, from this point, I want to jump to a question. This is a question I got on Facebook, and it had to do with how to handle a visitation in the mental hospital. What do you do with those visits? If you have a loved one in the hospital, how do you navigate that? This is going to be a hard one to navigate because I don't like to bring my wife into these discussions very much. I've said it before, but I do occasionally. When we talk about spouses and we pull them into these types of conversations, it can get a little hairy. It's one of the reasons that I recommended in the first video, like, hey, if you're married to someone with a mental health problem, guess what? Congrats, you need a therapist too. But I'm going to say this because I'm going to go into this because the only way I know how to answer it. When I was hospitalized, again, even after like the breakthrough moment, I was still in a pretty bad shape, right? I mean, I don't think anybody's happy-go-lucky in the mental hospital. Well, there was one guy. He'd been there for like 2 weeks, and he was all chipper. And we have a tendency to get kind of high off of mental health. We end up being therapists ourselves, and we walk around like, oh, I was just like you when I first came in, and now I feel so much better. And it's like, guy, Jesus, I wanted to choke him so bad. He was such a nice guy. He was such a good guy. And I just wanted to throw him off the top of the building. So in any case, if you're in a mental hospital and you're walking around, stop. You are not in a position to be looking down on others, damn it. In any case, nobody who is actually receiving the care they need is going to be walking around feeling that content with themselves. So I think one of the first things you have to understand about visiting someone in a mental hospital is they are in an incredibly timid and agitated state. So you should probably be prepared for an emotional outburst, for them to have a kind of irrational reaction to the things that they're saying. And here's the other thing too. I know for me, they pulled me off all my medication and then started to slowly medicate me in different ways to see what balanced me best. So at that point, I was in an agitated state because my medication was fluctuating. And in fact, they actually realized part of the reason I got so out of sorts before I went in is because one of my medicines didn't agree with me, which is so unbelievably common that I tell people sometimes, if you know someone's struggling with an issue, it could be that they need their medication managed, and that takes time to figure out. But in any case, my wife comes to visit me, and I have this very vivid memory of this. I have the vivid memory, but I don't remember what led up to it. We were talking with a therapist together about coming home. And I believe she expressed something about how does she handle the aftermath of having someone in the house who, obviously is still in recovery. And for my depressed mind, and this is something that happens quite a bit, and I'd like to do a video on this one day, I took that as an attack. And it's hilarious because it's not an attack. It's a perfectly legitimate, rational question. I was like, what do you mean? You afraid for me to come home? You think? And I immediately started making assumptions about what her question meant and what she was saying. And this turned into kind of a tense thing. And from there, I took it to, you came to visit me and now we're fighting. That's what depression does. And let me just say absolutely explicitly, she did nothing wrong when she was there. I just got agitated because I was in a vulnerable state and I still was not in a place where I could manage my emotions very well. I feel very naked right now, sharing these things, which I think is okay. That's kind of one of the things I set out to do when I started doing these videos. And the therapist stopped me. I always expect a therapist to kind of take my side and crap, and they rarely do, which is good because that's not what therapy is about. I am mashing the ever-living tar out of the stress brain right now. In any case, the therapist stopped and he pointed out, he's like, David, you are making assumptions and you're telling stories to yourself. You're telling stories about what's happening right now, and the stories that you're telling yourself are not real. You're making assumptions about what she thinks. You're making assumptions and you're telling stories about what she thinks and what she intends. And he's like, you have to get out of your own head and you have to stop telling yourself stories. Now, the reason I bring this up with this question of visitation in a mental hospital, and this connects directly to what I was saying about the beach ball therapy session. So many people go into the mental hospital and they leave with these very, very negative thoughts about what went on in the hospital, but it's actually the negatives are where the growth begins, right? The worst experiences are the ones that help us change and build up our ability to handle the problems that we have when we leave the hospital. That was one of the first times that someone was actually able to challenge my not so healthy thought processes, because I would never take it seriously when it came from her because we're fighting in that instance. But in this case, the therapist is like, you are not being rational. I needed that. I needed a therapist to look at our interaction and say to me, you are not rational right now. Right? I needed that. And that's something that my spouse could never give me because she's not a therapist. Right? So I still find myself sometimes, if I'm in a disagreement or, we're having a conversation about something and it starts to kind of blow up and I'm like, I'm telling myself stories. Right? I'm making assumptions and I'm not being rational. That was probably another one of the most important interactions I had in the hospital was the conversation we had with the therapist that directly revealed to me the thought patterns that I was basically throwing myself into. The point is, if you go and visit someone in the mental hospital, don't expect the reactions, don't expect the conversation, the visit to be positive. That's part of it, especially when the therapist is there. Be open to the truth and be open to the veracity of the experience. At that point, you want to have conversations that elicit the type of behavior and the type of thought that agitate, because that's where treatment comes from. So you probably don't want to go in with the mindset of treating them like a ticking time bomb. Like, oh no, I have to be so gentle with them. I have to keep them from getting upset. That's why we're there. It's only until our mind is agitated and we explode that someone can help us figure out how not to go boom, right? So if anything, if you're visiting someone in the mental hospital, you want to be normal. You want to go in and treat them almost like they're not hospitalized at all, right? I'm coming in and having a conversation with you. Let's talk. Let's interact. Because you have to bring them a slice of the real world. They are protected in this moment in the hospital, that they can't hurt themselves and they can't hurt anyone else. But they need a slice of the real world to come to them so that they can learn, because that's what the mental hospital is essentially trying to do, trying to rebuild you, right? We can't build our skills if we're being treated with kid gloves. So for this question, again, just to kind of sum everything up, we don't want to go in and be tender and be fragile with people, because we want, in essence, we want to kind of elicit the behaviors they need help with anyway. Right. That was one of the single most important experiences I ever had in the hospital. There's been a bunch of them. I wrote about them in the memoir. So yeah, basically, so many of the assumptions that you have about hospitalization are wrong, because you want to create a place where growth can occur, and growth cannot occur if you have them wrapped in styrofoam, if you are protecting them, right? So keep that in mind, especially if you go into a mental hospital, you're visiting, and the interaction does turn mostly negative. That's not necessarily the failure you may think it is. That could be an extremely important moment for them, especially if the therapist is there. So you're going in and you're talking to someone who is in a fragile state, and agitation is probably one of the most important things they can have then anyway. So don't sweat it. Go in and be yourself. Go in and interact with them honestly, patiently. Obviously, bring with you a bit of empathy, and understand that the person that you're interacting with in the mental hospital very likely won't be the person they are when they come out. And they are a work in progress, right? We all are. I still have mental habits that are just absolutely horrible. I still stay up way too late sometimes playing Call of Duty just to try to relieve the mental pressure in my head, and then I'm worse off the next day. We're all works in progress. So, this has been a lot more difficult for me than I thought it would. Normally, when I tell stories about the mental hospital, when I talk about mental hospitalization, I turn it 100% to humor, because that's kind of like the buffer I put between myself and it. And you'll see that I do that a lot in the memoir if you read it. But no, it is difficult. And now I kind of feel like I need to go have like a gas station hot dog or something. But I find it important to retread up these things every once in a while, because believe it or not, I still get into these thought patterns sometimes that are negative. I still find myself being irrational in conversations with people. I still find myself making assumptions, telling stories, letting my anger kind of sort of lead me by the nose somewhere I don't want to be. And I still stop sometimes and I think, what did you learn in the mental hospital? What were the coping mechanisms that they armed you with there? The affirmative statements, the ways to relieve that pressure. Yeah. Anyway, this has been a fun one. Mental hospitalization is a very, very complicated topic. I still have lots of stories to tell about it. I personally would prefer never to go back in, but I'm not. The likelihood of having to go back one day is actually pretty high. So if I do, I'll come back with even more. Yay! So in any case, that's it for today. And be nice to each other. We're all works in progress. And I appreciate everybody who has watched the stream, and hope you guys all have a pleasant day.